So today's video, we are going to talk about baptism. Now, if you were at Faith Alliance Church's service on Sunday, you know why we're talking about baptism, but if not, I'll fill you in. We had 9 people declare their faith in the Lord Jesus and profess that faith publicly through the waters of baptism this past Sunday. And man, it was thrilling. It was an encouraging service to hear story after story after story of people saying yes to Jesus, and then detailing all the circumstances that got them to that point, and then all the circumstances that got them to the point of confessing and professing Jesus in a way that they wanted to do so publicly. So it was a great service. It was important for us to remember that God is still rescuing his people. God is still working in lives. He's still changing lives. That was a huge reminder to me throughout the preparation for the service, but then the service itself, to remember that God is still changing lives. He's still rescuing his people. And I want to talk about the experiential form of baptism, not necessarily the theological, though that's a good conversation, but really the experiential form of baptism. And the invitation today in this video is just going to be to remember your own baptism if, in fact, you've been baptized. We'll get to that in a minute, but we live in a world that will communicate everything but the fact that God is still rescuing his people, right? We live in a world where God seems to feel indifferent sometimes through the things that we hear, or that he's altogether missing, or that's kind of the rhetoric that comes our way, that God is a figment of our imagination almost. And what I think sticks out to me in the baptisms that we saw on Sunday is that person after person after person came to the same conclusion through very different means. There were some similar threads that came up over and over in those stories. There's a great need displayed, that people came to a great need, and that need was different, but within that need there was a great desire to see something happen. And in every place, in every way, in every moment of need, God met those individuals. And that's something to be celebrated, that God is still doing that. He's still meeting people in their great need and rescuing us out of our own incapacity to find salvation on our own. And so because we live in a world that thinks the opposite of that, and always had, we just have better means to communicate those things now, we have to be reminded. We have to remember what it is that we've gotten ourselves into. We have to remember the life that Christ has offered us. And so when we're tempted to fall into the same rhetoric that the world gives us, that God is indifferent or missing, we are called to remember exactly what it is God is doing. That's why baptisms are so powerful and so important. They remind us just how good God is and that he is still working in and through the world. See, God is never surprised, and he knows how temperamental our memories are. And he has given us helpful images to anchor us into faith. We'll get to baptism, but all throughout the Bible, there's incredible images that God has given us to hold on to use to remember how good he is and what he is doing. The burning bush, right, Exodus 3, the tabernacle and God's glory. We have images to hold on to. Christ has given us communion as an image to hold on to the goodness of Jesus, to remember what he's done until he comes again. And he's given us baptism as an image of our lives entering into his life through our death under the water and our salvation and life in him coming out of the water. If you've trusted Jesus for salvation and have been baptized, you have an event that you can come back to over and over and over again to remember what God has done and to remember what you've committed to. See, baptism is never old news because it's a vow, it's a commitment that we made. If you're married, you've made wedding vows. Those are promises that you've made. They're ways that you've publicly committed to another person. Baptism is a commitment to say, I have publicly professed this faith in which I believe. And so there's an anchoring that happens when we remember our own baptisms. when we come back to the place where we remember where, what, who, and why we did those things. I was baptized in my mid-20s in a lake in the summer in Wisconsin. I was baptized by a guy named Bill Ronsheimer. I'll never forget him. A huge boon and encouragement to my faith. The church and my friends were on the shore of this lake as I was being baptized. I even remember that there were fish in the lake that were kind of nibbling at my toes while I was being baptized. And so it became an incredibly important moment for me to say, I have publicly decided to follow Christ. And it's a moment that, as I've been preparing for this baptism service this past week, I've been coming back to and remembering that commitment, remembering all that God has done and all that God has continued to do through that time. So if you trusted in Jesus and you've been baptized, whether it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago or maybe last year, it's an event that you can come back to remember what God has done to get you to that point and what God continues to do from that point. We too went under the water to symbolize this old life going away and came up out of the water to symbolize Christ's life in us. And so this baptism represents a new identity, that we are now identified with Jesus. We publicly identify with Christ. It's an important point in our lives to remember what God has done and what he's still doing. And we can use our baptisms as a reference for his work, an image of our complete submission to him. There's this idea by this guy named Soren Kierkegaard that's called repetition. And he says repetition is the act of recollecting forward. He says it's not helpful to think back on things because that's recollection, it's in the past, it's already happened. But he said you can use and utilize repetition. It's the act of recollecting forward, taking things that have happened to us and bringing them into our present moment to think about them so that they help us change and form and grow forward. And so this idea of repetition is helpful when we think of baptisms. As we think about our own baptism, no matter how long it was ago, we can bring it into our present thought process and think about it. We can mull it over. We can thank God for it again. It becomes just as fresh because it's a commitment of the living God on our behalf in our public connection with him. And so I'm going to read a quote actually from a different author, but I wanted to invite you over the next few moments just to think about your own baptism. Think about what God has done to get you to that place and that what God has continued to do since then. That he has never left you, nor forsaken you, that he has continued and will complete the work that he began in you. And baptism becomes a good anchor point, a good image to remember what it is he's done and all that's happened. Flannery O'Connor is an author who wrote in the mid-20th century. She's one of my favorites, and she wrote a lot about the Christian life, though through a very strange lens, but she wrote a lot about the Christian life and wrote a lot about the importance of and the centrality of God and the gospel within the human condition. And so she wrote a lot about the way that she wrote. And so I want to read you a quote about the way that she would write about important events in people's lives. And she singles out baptism to show just how much work she would do in the story to make sure people understood just how important this idea of baptism is. And this is from Flannery O'Connor, who says, "When I write a novel in which the central action is a baptism, I am very well aware that for a majority of my readers, baptism is a meaningless rite. And so in my novel, I have to see that this baptism carries enough awe and mystery to jar the reader into some kind of emotional recognition of its significance. To this end, I have to bend the whole novel, its language, its structure, its action. I have to make the reader feel in his bones, if nowhere else, that something is going on here that counts. Distortion, in this case, is an instrument. Exaggeration has a purpose, and the whole structure of the story or novel has been made what it is because of belief. This is not the kind of distortion that destroys, it is the kind that reveals or should reveal." Now, here's the point in that quote, is that everything bends toward baptism. She says it's that important. I have to bend the whole novel, its language, its structure, its action, everything bend towards that one place because it's that important. Something is going on here that counts. And as I got to really be in the front seat of the action on Sunday, being able to baptize those 9 believers, I recognized that something important is going on here. Everything is bending toward baptism. It's an authentic and real communication of the gospel. So this week, if you get the chance coming off a great service, remember your baptism. Take some time to remember your public statement of faith to a church body. Whether it happened at Faith Alliance Church or elsewhere, I was baptized elsewhere. Take some time and remember and reflect, practice repetition, bring that memory into your thought so that you continue to anchor your life in the constant repetition and understanding of the goodness of God in the land of the living. That what God has done, He is continuing to do. Think of what God has done to get you to your baptism, and then think of all the things that God has done to take you from your point of baptism to today, however long that is. And trust that everything that God has done, He will continue to do. He's expansive in His mercy, and He continues to reveal it as we experience this past week.